book of Job. Over the years, Job has become one of my favorite books in the Bible. It's an amazing, deep, and really intriguing book. It covers a lot of ground. Of course, what do we normally think of when we think of Job? Anybody? Suffering, affliction. That's the big theme and how he responded to that and how God had to correct the thinking, especially of his friends who were blaming him for his suffering. James mentions this in his epistle. Let's read from James chapter 5. As an example, brethren, of suffering and patience, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we count those blessed who endured. You've heard of the endurance of Job and have seen the outcome of the Lord's dealings, that the Lord is full of compassion and is merciful. Indeed, we've all heard of the suffering, the endurance, or as the King James Bible puts it, the patience of Job. But today, I would like us to explore an aspect of Job's life and character that's usually eclipsed by the horrendous suffering that he and his family went through. Instead of the patience of Job, let's see what his book says about the justice of Job. But before we dig into this, I would like all of us, especially me, to hit a kind of a reset button with regard to attitude about helping the poor. The book of Proverbs and the Apostle Paul have many choice words for the able-bodied who refuse to work and for those who habitually make foolish, self-destructive lifestyle decisions that keep them perpetually in poverty. We're not talking about enabling irresponsible or sinful behavior when we advocate helping the poor. These are not the people that the Proverbs, Jesus, and the apostles admonished us to help. And those are not the people that Job was helping. Now, to be sure, we should try at least to minister to those people. They need Jesus. They need a transformed life. But that's not the focus of the passages that we'll be looking at today. The poor people that Job was concerned for were the truly helpless, those who were afflicted through no fault of their own and desperately needed an advocate. First, a little background on the book of Job. The book is almost certainly the oldest book in the Bible in terms of the date of its original authorship. We don't know exactly when the book was written or by whom, but we do have some clues. Job and his friends were clearly Semitic people from the same general language group and patriarchal culture as Abraham. There are no references in Job to the law of Moses or to the Hebrew tribes. Job significantly predates Moses. In spite of the errors in thinking that God thoroughly reproved them for, beginning with chapter 38, Job and his friends had the same general understanding that Abraham and his descendants did of God's character, his divine attributes, and his supreme authority over all things as the Almighty Creator God. They also understood that it was the holy character of God himself that defined the moral framework within which they had to live. The words for God used in the book of Job, El, Elohim, Eloah, refer to God Almighty and the one who is worshipped. The word Jehovah or Yahweh does not appear in the book of Job. In Job, we see many of the same theological and moral concepts that we see throughout the rest of the Old Testament and some in the New Testament. These men knew the one true God, although imperfectly, and at the end of the book, God dealt with Job and his friends at a direct personal level, much as he did with Abraham. An interesting clue to Job's time in history is his age at death. According to Job 42:16, he lived 140 years after the events recorded in the book. Job was already a highly respected older man and the father of 10 adult children when his troubles began, making him possibly 60 years old or considerably older than that at the time of his troubles. That gives him a lifespan of at least 200 years, which is similar to the later post-flood patriarchs. After the flood, the lifespans of the patriarchs rapidly declined. And as a kind of a data point, Terah, the father of Abraham, died at the age of 205. And this doesn't prove that Job lived during the 20th century BC, but it is suggestive. Now, some scholars have pointed out that point to the names and the lineage of some of Job's friends, such as Eliphaz the Temanite and Bildad the Shuhite, as possible evidence that Job may have lived a little later, around the 16th century BC. One of the grandsons of Jacob's son Esau was named Teman. In these early tribal times, his descendants would have been called Temanites. After the death of Sarah, Abraham had a son by Keturah whose name was Shua. In like manner, Shua's descendants would have been called Shuhites. Of course, this idea depends on the ancestors of Eliphaz and Bildad being the same Teman and Shua from Abraham's lineage, which may or may not have been true. Either way, the book of Job is a truly ancient book. The book's classified as both wisdom literature and as poetry. The prologue and the conclusion of Job are written in straight prose, but everything in the middle is written in poetic form. As such, it's a priceless gem of ancient Near Eastern literature, and for us, a really hard read in English. But I like it anyway. It's worth the trouble, believe me. As a highly educated prince of Egypt, Moses probably had access to the book of Job and would have recognized it as being from God and not from a pagan source. Moses is probably the one who included it in the early body of Old Testament scripture. Even though most of the book is in poetic form, we know that Job is not a fictional or allegorical character, but a historical figure because he's referred to that way elsewhere in the Bible. In Ezekiel 14 is a prophecy against the blatant idolatry of the elders of Israel. Because of this idolatry, severe judgment was going to befall the land. And to underscore just how complete the spiritual corruption was, God made the following statement that reveals how extremely highly he thought of Job. Even though these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in its midst, by their own righteousness they could only deliver themselves, declare the Lord. He repeats the same thing 3 more times in verses 16, 18, and 20, holding up Noah, Daniel, and Job as models of righteous biblical manhood. In his book, Missing from Action, subtitled Vanishing Manhood in America, Weldon M. Hardenbrook laments what he calls the death of biblical masculinity, and he provides quite a bit of scriptural insight into what to do about it. I really like this book. In chapter 9, he holds up the description in Job chapter 29 as an excellent model for biblical manhood. This is where we'll see what I'm calling the justice of Job. In chapter 29 of Job, he looks back on his life prior to his overwhelming afflictions, but surprisingly, he doesn't dwell exclusively on his own physical condition or the lost lives of his late children or his lost prosperity. These things are mentioned in verses 1 through 6, but most of his discourse in verses 7 through 25, the rest of the chapter, relates to his position of authority and the services he was able to render to others when he had the resources to do so. It's a very unselfish perspective on his affliction. In Job 29, the first 6 verses, and also the first 2 chapters of the book of Job, we learn about his former personal circumstances. At the very beginning of the book, we find out that Job was a godly and tremendously wealthy man. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. And 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. His possessions also were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and very many servants. And that man was the greatest of all the men of the East. Now, while there are many uncertainties about the life and times of Job, I think we can be certain that he pitched his tents upwind of the livestock. And this reminded me of when I was stationed at Goodfellow Air Force Base in San Angelo, Texas. There were some goat farms not far from the base, and when the wind came from a certain direction, it was really something. Okay. I digress, I'm sorry. We also learned from Job chapter 1, verses 4 to 5, that he regularly prayed and offered sacrifices for his 10 children. And his sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one on his day, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And it came about, when the days of feasting had completed their cycle, that Job would send and consecrate them, rising up early in the morning and offering burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "Perhaps my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did continually. Job's incredible response to the sudden loss of all of his material wealth and the tragic deaths of all 10 children completely falsified Satan's vicious accusation that Job would turn against God if these things were lost. In Job chapter 1, verses 9 through 11, then Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Hast thou not made a hedge about him and his house and all that he has on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But put forth thy hand now and touch all that he has. He will surely curse thee to thy face." But Satan didn't expect Job's response to these calamities. Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head, and he fell to the ground and worshiped. He worshiped. It's amazing. And he said, "Naked came I from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Through all this, Job did not sin, nor did he blame God. Well, Satan's frustration mounted as Job held fast his integrity, even after his body was covered with boils, and he incited Job's wife, who was totally overwhelmed with grief and pain by this point, and I really don't judge Mrs. Job for this, to get Job to curse God as Satan had predicted he would. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity?" So much for the prosperity gospel, okay? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Well, after much wrangling with Job's 3 friends, who could see no possible cause for Job's affliction rather than that he must have sinned, we come to chapter 29, where Job looks back on happier times before all of this happened, and he laments his current circumstances. And Job took up his discourse and said, "Oh, that I were as in months gone by, as in the days when God watched over me, when his lamp shone over my head, and by his light I walked through darkness, as I was in the prime of my days, when the friendship of God was over my tent, when the Almighty was yet with me, and my children were around me, when my steps were bathed in butter, and the rock poured out for me streams of oil." Well, if Job had stopped here, we wouldn't blame him. We would mourn with him and his wife for all they had lost, especially the 10 children. We would weep with those who weep, as Paul instructs us in Romans 12:15. And as Job's friends actually did for a while in chapter 2, verses 11 to 13, when they first went to comfort him, and before they blew it and started overthinking the problem. But the focus for Job's mourning went way beyond his own personal and material loss. Job 29, verses 7 through 11, talks about his former respect and authority. "When I went out to the gate of the city, when I took my seat in the square, the young men saw me and hid themselves, and the old men arose and stood. The princes stopped talking and put their hands on their mouths. The voice of the nobles was hushed, and their tongue stuck to their palate. For when the ear heard, it called me blessed, and when the eye saw, it gave witness of me." Now, besides demonstrating the enormous respect that Job commanded, this passage raises some interesting questions. Why, for example, did the princes clam up and the other nobles have their mouths go dry as Job showed up? They may have had reason to feel more than a bit uncomfortable around Job, over and above just the respect that he commanded because of who he was. Verses 12 to 17 might explain why at least some of them had this reaction. In those verses, we see Job as a champion of the poor and the oppressed. Because I delivered the poor who cried for help, and the orphan who had no helper, the blessing of the one ready to perish came upon me, and I made the widow's heart sing for joy. I put on righteousness, and it clothed me. My justice was like a robe and a turban. I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. I was a father to the needy, and I investigated the case which I did not know. And I broke the jaws of the wicked and snatched the prey from his teeth. I think Job's motive in saying these things was twofold. The first and most obviously, his conduct during those years was well known to everyone and contradicted the accusations of sin that his misguided friends were throwing at him. Second, he genuinely regretted losing the ability to materially help the poor, the widows and the orphans, and to thwart the wicked who would exploit the vulnerable people in his community. Let's look at each of the actions mentioned in this passage a little more closely. In verse 12, we see Job delivered the poor who cried for help. Now, there are many parallels, as I mentioned before, between parts of the book of Job and the book of Proverbs. Proverbs 21:13 and 28:27 admonish us not to ignore the cries of the poor. And I like the way that the Keith Green song talked about this very thing, shutting one's eyes to the need. He who shuts his ear to the cry of the poor will also cry himself and will not be answered. In Proverbs 21:13. And then in 28:27, he who gives to the poor will never want, but he who shuts his eyes will have many curses. God does not want his people to ignore the plight of the poor. It's easy to do, but he does not want us to do that. Look at Job's intense attitudes and feelings about the poor and the oppressed. And this is from Job chapter 30, verse 25. Have I not wept for the one whose life is hard? Was not my soul grieved for the needy? So Job didn't just hear the cry of the poor. He felt their cry with great empathy. He let their pitiful condition get to him emotionally. And this is where I fall down, typically. It actually moved him to tears, as well as to action on their behalf. Job understood that the poor have every bit as much human dignity as the more fortunate. Speaking hypothetically, in chapter 31, Job said this: if I have despised the claim of my male or female slaves when they filed a complaint against me, what then could I do when God arises and when he calls me to account? And what will I answer him? Did not he who made me in the womb make him, and the same one fashion us in the womb? He realized his exalted position in society did not give him more dignity before God than his slave. Once again, we see parallels to Proverbs regarding the human dignity of the poor as people created in God's image. He who oppresses the poor reproaches his maker, but he who is gracious to the needy honors him, him being his maker. Proverbs 14:31. Job was gracious to the poor. He interacted with them with kindness, respect, and dignity, never with an attitude of superiority or condescension, or as many have done, with contempt. Also in verse 12, we see that he delivered the orphan who had no helper. And before doing this study, I had never noticed in Job 31, verses 16 to 18, that he actually took in orphans and raised them as if they were his own children. A man with 10 children of his own did this. The following passage is part of his defense. He's continuing to list things that would merit judgment if he had done them. But of course, he has done the opposite. If I have kept the poor from their desire, or have caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or have eaten my morsel alone, and the orphan has not shared it, but, and here's the interesting part, but from my mouth he grew up with me as with a father, and from infancy I guided her. Apparently, Job took in orphans into his own home. Orphans may be the class of people who are the most powerless and vulnerable to cruelty and exploitation by evil people. Besides simple neglect that can lead to disease and starvation, the modern world sees orphans exploited by human trafficking into various forms of slavery and forced conscription as child soldiers. In Job's time, an orphan might end up as a slave or have his or her property taken away, which should have been an inheritance from the parents. Job prevented this kind of thing when he could. In Job 31, again, verses 21 to 22, if I have lifted up my hand against the orphan because I saw I had support in the gate, let my shoulder fall from the socket and my arm be broken off at the elbow. Notice the phrase, because I saw I had support at the gate. The gate is where the elders of the city, the nobles and the leaders, including Job, gathered and judged. Remember those nobles whose mouths went dry when Job showed up at the gate in chapter 29, verse 10? If any of them had been involved in trying to profit by cheating or exploiting a widow or an orphan, they would have to go through Job, and probably his friends first. It would have resulted in shame to them and possibly worse. I don't think any of them would have relished the thought of standing up to Job for an unrighteous cause. In verse 13, the one ready to perish blessed Job, presumably for their rescue from death. Job delivered those who might have otherwise died from hypothermia during the cold winter's night. We see this in Job 31, 19 to 20. If I have seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or that the needy had no covering, if his loins have not thanked me, and if he has not been warmed with the fleece of my sheep, and he goes on. The phrase, if his loins have not thanked me, refers to providing food to someone who's hungry or starving. Again in verse 13, we see he made the widow's heart sing for joy. Typical widow's problem in ancient times, especially widows with small children and no surviving extended family, was a lack of income and ability to pay anyone to work the land that she might have. Widows had to work hard, but it was often impossible to keep up with the demands of life. This made them almost as vulnerable as orphans to many forms of exploitation. She might be forced in desperation to sell off her land, but unscrupulous buyers would offer her far less than it was worth, or give her loans to keep her perpetually in debt, or even find a way to cheat on the acreage of land that they wanted to buy from her. Job chapter 24, verses 2 through 10 lists many bad things that wicked people do to widows and orphans and the poor in general. And these are all things that Job worked hard to prevent or correct. Some remove landmarks. They seize and devour flocks. They drive away the donkeys of the orphans. They take the widow's ox for a pledge. They push the needy aside from the road. The poor of the land are made to hide themselves altogether. Behold, as wild donkeys in the wilderness they go forth, seeking food in their activity, as bread for their children in the desert. They harvest their fodder in the field, and they glean the vineyard of the wicked. They spend the night naked, without clothing, and have no covering against the cold. They are wet with the mountain rains, and they hug the rock for want of a shelter. Others snatch the orphan from the breast, and against the poor they take a pledge. They cause the poor to go about naked, without clothing, and they take away the sheaves from the hungry. The reference to removing landmarks in Job 24:2 has its parallel in Proverbs 22:28. Do not move the ancient boundary which your fathers have set. Moving boundary markers and pretending they were in their original location was a form of stealing land. Most of the time, it would be hard to get away with this, but it might work if used against an overwrought, desperate, and distracted widow. Verse 14, Job clothed himself with justice like a robe and a turban. Job recognized that the poor and the needy had a right to justice. Throughout all of human history, it's always been easier for the strong, the rich, the well-educated, and the influential people to obtain justice in a court of law than it has been for the poor. Often, there's been a presumption that somehow the poor were less important than others in the grand scheme of things, and therefore less deserving of justice. But we've already seen that this attitude is soundly contradicted by God's view that all human beings, regardless of station in life, have the same rights and dignity before God. Who then are human officials to deny them these rights? When the book of Proverbs talks about the rights of the poor, it isn't talking about material possessions, but equal standing under the law. Proverbs 29:7 says it all. The righteous is concerned for the rights of the poor. The wicked does not understand such concern. It's a good description of Job's understanding of how justice should relate to the poor. Job is also a perfect example of the instructions given in Proverbs 31, 8-9. Open your mouth for the dumb, for the rights of all the unfortunate. Open your mouth, judge righteously, and defend the rights of the afflicted and needy. There are Christian legal ministries, such as OC International, that work in behalf of the poor, both domestically and in parts of the world where religious and ethnic minorities are kept in poverty and oppressed by unjust legal systems. Back to Job 29, verse 15. Job was the eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. Remember that Job had many people working for him. Obviously, he couldn't do everything himself, but he could learn of the needs and make sure that they were taken care of. We don't know how he did it, but as eyes to the blind and feet to the lame, Job located the physically disabled, who in his days were usually beggars, if they had no well-to-do family to take care of them, and met their needs as best he could. Then in verse 16, Job, private investigator. We've seen many ways in which Job was a father to the needy, but the second half of chapter 29, verse 16 is really intriguing. I investigated the case which I did not know. On occasion, Job served as a private investigator. People could come to him with a case in which they had somehow been cheated. Job would put on his robe and turban of justice and check it out. He also had the clout to set things right when necessary, which brings us to what I call the dental part of chapter in verse 17. Job broke the jaws of the wicked and it snatched the prey from his teeth. Now this is poetic language, but as with each of the other verses in the section, it had real-world practical application. There were no doubt times when Job had to use force or the threat of force to secure justice for others who had been cheated, oppressed, or otherwise exploited by those more powerful than they. Maybe some of the nobles at the gate had sore jaws. Job lived in very different times, and this passage should not be used to advocate vigilantism. However, as advocates for the poor and oppressed, Christians can bring relief to the genuinely needy who are powerless to help themselves, to those who've been driven from their homes by war, to those who have been cheated, denied legal rights by unscrupulous employers or corrupt government officials, and to those who've been trafficked into modern forms of slavery. And there are many ministries dealing with exactly these problems. We can also be instrumental in calling down the full force of the law on those who have earned it. Finally, Job lived nearly 4,000 years ago, but his life speaks volumes to us today. In the first two chapters, where we see Satan challenging God to lift his blessing and protection from Job, and predicting that if he did so, Job would curse him to his face, we see how intensely Satan hated the man. I think a big part of the reason for this was not just that Job was extraordinarily blessed and privileged, but that he spent a large part of his energy and resources helping other people at the bottom of the social and economic ladder. And he did so not to be thought well of by others, as the Pharisees did almost 2,000 years later, but out of a genuine heart of empathy and compassion. Trinity has always been a solidly biblical, doctrinally sound church, and by the grace of God, we always will be. But for the last several years, the elders have felt led to involve the church more directly in compassionate ministries, as we've done with Family Promise and also with GUM. In the coming weeks, we're going to hear from several leaders of Christian compassionate ministries in our local area that Trinity may be able to participate in. I'd like to encourage everyone to join us during the Sunday school hour for the When Helping Hurts video series. There's only 1 week of that left, but it's still worth coming to see. And for the guest speakers later this summer. Compassionate ministry was dear to Job's heart and central to the ministry of Jesus. Jesus sent the following message to John the Baptist. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. Let's pray.